Okay, so I have some question about the West in general. So it seems to me like right now it's very hard to determine left from right. You see, the traditional leftist, I see myself belong to the traditional Jimmy Dore kind of a left person.
Mm.
But I don't see any other left people, prominent at least, like in the US, who are traditional anti-war and for free speech, right? Right now, the anti-war voices, the speech, the free speech, all coming from the right. People like Tucker Carlson, Rand Paul, right? These are the voices that anti-war and the support, Julian Assange, that kind of a thing. And it's people like Mark Warner, the senator from Virginia. He's the one who initiated this Restriction Act, which is pretty much everything against the First Amendment. From my reading, it's a terrible act, legislation. But seems to me like, even though you don't hear much right now, but it sounds to me like they are going to pass one form or another, some kind of way of restricting something. And that's Mark Warner is a Democrat. I met him a few times. But anyway, so I feel like is that also the same is going on in UK and in Europe in general? Like, what exactly is the Green Party doing, right? And all those sort of things. So do you think in the West right now there is some kind of a political realignment going on? I want to see.
Well, I think you've touched on the single greatest change that there has been in the left in the West over the last 30 years, which is the collapse, the disappearance of the left, and it is something of a mystery. One of the reasons why it is a mystery is that there is no real admission that it has happened. People don't admit that the left has disappeared, even though it has disappeared. And it's you're absolutely correct. Politics, society in Europe and in the United States was always historically constructed around a left-right division, starting all the way, it goes all the way back to the French Revolution. The expressions left and right date from the French Revolution. There was the meetings in Versailles of the Estates General, which the king called this sort of parliament, and the people who were opposed to him sat on the left and the nobles sat on the right. And that was where the expression left and right came from. And over time, a whole series of political ideas became associated with the left: intervention in the economy, concern for social justice, anti-imperialism, all those kind of things, and concern for civil liberties, because the people who tended to support the left were from the lower demographic classes, and they were the people who perhaps needed most to have their civil liberties protected. Anyway, that all became associated with the left, and the right had different policies: laissez-faire economics, concern for protection, private property rights, a more, one should say, sometimes a more authoritarian approach to political debate as well. And then in the 1990s, very mysteriously, that all shattered. It ended both in the United States with the Clinton period, when Clinton talked about triangulation. It ended in Britain when Blairism, to a great extent, copied what Clinton was doing, and it's basically died out in Europe as well. And you see these extraordinary reversals. So the Green Party in Germany, which in the 1970s and 1980s was anti-war, anti-nuclear party, is now the most pro-war party in Europe. I mean, to a degree that is dizzying. And quite how this has come about and why it has come about has never been fully explained. But it's important to say it is an elite phenomenon. It's not that the grassroots turned away. There's still always that core of people in Europe, in probably the United States, who remain attached or attracted to the ideas of the old traditional left. You saw that very vividly in Britain with the Corbyn movement, when, as I say, working class voters rallied briefly again to the Labour Party, because, you know, he seemed to be saying the kind of things that they remembered old Labour leaders, when the Labour Party was a left-wing socialist party, used to say. So that hasn't gone away. But at the very top, in the political class, you have to speak about a unified political class with a very limited set of ideas, which are no longer easily identified as either left or right, because with the disappearance of the left, there is less reason any longer to have a right. I mean, you know, how can you define something as being on the right when there is no left to define against? So you have this convergence in the political class and a professionalization of politics, which is very noticeable in Britain. In other words, you have people in the parties for whom politics has become their profession, it's their career. Whereas in Britain, it wasn't like that. I mean, you know, people went into politics because they belonged to a particular social movement and that pushed them upwards, but they never thought of it in career terms in that way. Now, politics has become a kind of professional career, and it's very different. It's not really explained. Nobody really explains how it's come about, but actually what it has done is that it's created a very authoritarian political landscape, because ideas are no longer circulating in the kind of way that they used to. And the fact that it pretends to be the old system, because we still have, you know, parties with the old names, but they all agree with each other about everything. They can't really allow open debate to happen, because if they did allow open debate, well, they would very quickly lose control of the political system, because they would be challenged because of the fact that they all agree with each other. So we've seen this collapse in the left and the right. You mentioned Jimmy Dore, whom I briefly know, by the way. He represents, if you like, not the old left, but the real left.
The traditional left.
The traditional left.
Yeah.
Which has been pushed to the margins pretty much everywhere. The only way politics can return to Europe and the West is if that starts to come back again. The old left starts to come back again. And you mentioned Tucker Carlson. That's a point he has also made. He has made the point that he missed, even though he's on the right, he misses the old left.
Yeah. Because I actually think the traditional left and right has a lot of things in common. You know, it's they both care about the masses, you know, the lower middle class. And I actually think both sides, the traditional classic left and right, actually on that point, I actually think they both do. They just have different approaches, right? How to solve that problem, but fundamentally they care. Right now, the ruling class doesn't care. That's
well, exactly, because the old parties, the old left and the old right, were rooted in society. They were social movements. So they were, you know, you would have people who were part of that, and you would meet them in you meet them workplace, you'd meet them in bars, you'd meet them in social settings. You'd have. Now it isn't like that, because with the very professional politics that we have today, politics is entirely a factional issue within the elite. And when it's an elite thing in that kind of way, of course, they've lost interest in the people, the wider population. And going back to what we were saying about Britain, that's why there is an absence of ideas and an absence of understanding on the part of the elite of what's going on in broader society, and why in Britain today we have administration instead of government.
So it's the elite that consolidated, more or less, right? And even though the grassroots hasn't changed, but the elite consolidated. And that's including the media, right?
Yes.
That's why the media is become the way they have become the mainstream, right? And so they consolidate as well, right? So
Absolutely, because they are as much a part of the political elite as the
uh-huh.
people who are represented in Congress or Parliament and
Yeah.
wherever.
Mhm.
And I mean, and what binds it all together is, to be quite clear about this, is money. I mean,
Yeah,
corruption,
yeah.
corruption, which, as I said, in Britain
Mhm.
formerly barely existed, has now become very widespread. Because, of course, if the political class sees things in terms of following a professional career,
Mhm.
the point of that is enrich yourself. And
Yeah. Yeah.
unfortunately, government, unless it's very well anchored, in social class,
Mhm.
lends itself to that kind of abuse. And that's becoming a very widespread problem in Britain today.
Okay. Yeah. So I have this question that kind of related to it, is that now Churchill supposedly said that it has been the government, the democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms. So it turns out I did a little bit of digging. It's not exactly what he said. So here is what he said. This is the speech he gave in the Commons in 1947. So here is what he said. He said, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But there is the broad feeling in our country that the people should rule, and the public opinion expressed by all constitutional means should shape, guide, and control the actions of ministers who are their servants and not their masters." So this is what he said. To me, it sounds like he actually doesn't fully agree with this idea that democracy is the best of the worst or something. So I want to see, with the current situation in the West, what do you see this? Is democracy, when we say democracy, we say electoral democracy, right? So what is your opinion about this? Is the,
Yeah.
election is the best way in terms of democracy, or?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Let's just turn first to Churchill, because he's an interesting figure, and I want to just say a few things about the Churchill was from a family of the British aristocracy. He was very, very privileged aristocracy. He belonged to that small group of families which in the 18th and 19th century had basically run Britain and run the empire. He was a committed imperialist, and he was somebody who was very, very committed to preserving the British Empire, and at the center and core of the empire, preserving the position of his particular class, his aristocratic class. He was not someone who was particularly attracted to democracy. That rather cynical statement that you've just expressed is very much his personal view. I mean, he had, for example, mixed feelings about the United States. He found the United States in the 1920s and 1930s altogether too democratic for his particular tastes. So he's a much more interesting and far more complicated person than is widely understood. Like a lot of British aristocrats, he was very, very skilled at using the political system and the emerging democratic system in order to maintain the control of his class. But towards the end of his life, as that control seemed to slip away, he became even more skeptical about it. So, as I said, you're quite right to quote the entire statement, and notice how he prefaces it as it is said. Said by whom? I mean, this is typical of Churchill. He was very clever at this. He would often come up with clever things, clever statements like this. Very clever, very witty man, and sort of semi jokes, and attribute them to others, where more often than not he'd invented them himself. So people take that phrase of his altogether too seriously. But let's talk about the serious situation. Electoral politics in the West only makes sense in the kind of situation which we were talking about earlier, where there is a real left and a real right, where there are real disagreements and conflicts about how society should be taken.
Yeah,
And when you have a proper media and
Yeah.
proper political forces rooted in society and expressed through large social movements, if that does not exist, as it doesn't exist any longer, then elections become a ritual.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
start to become drained
Mhm,
of purpose.
mhm.
And in order to maintain the appearance of elections, you create all kinds of false issues and stories in order to sort of create a kind of theatre. But again, it doesn't have the real meaning that it did anymore. So I think if you were talking about the West in, say, 1960, at that time, you could talk about the West. You could talk about the West and talk about an electoral democracy, and there was some truth to it. I mean, it's never as true as people in the West pretended, but there was some truth to it. Today, there is far less truth to that anymore. We still have on the fringes of our political system elements of free discussion or freer discussion as a legacy of that former time. But the political class that controls the public conversation and controls the media are trying to restrict that all the time.